The first sign was the snow. It had fallen on Monday night, a light dusting, barely enough to cover the ground, and by Tuesday morning it lay undisturbed in the small clearing at the base of the granite shelf. No tracks leading out, no pressed lines where heavy paws had dragged through the crust toward the tree line. The entrance to the den, a low dark gap beneath the rock overhang, sat as still as it had the evening before. Merrick noted it without particular concern. Bears in late winter could go days without emerging, especially in cold spells. He marked it in his log and moved on. By Wednesday, the temperature had dropped again, and the snow in front of the den was still untouched. He stood at the clearing's edge for a few minutes, watching. The bracken on either side of the entrance held its position. The small birch sapling to the left of the overhang, the one she sometimes brushed against on her way out, was perfectly still. No disturbance, no sign. He pressed a wooden stake into the frozen soil at the trail marker and walked back through the trees. Merrick had been patrolling this particular stretch of the valley for 11 years. He knew it the way people know old houses, not just the layout, but the feel of it, the particular quality of its silence at different times of year, the way the light moved through the canopy in winter versus spring. He knew which sections of the ridge collected wind and which stayed calm. He knew where the ice formed last and melted first. And he knew this den, this specific hollow in the granite shelf on the north-facing slope, because she had been using it since his 3rd year on the route. She was a large female, not the largest he had tracked, but substantial, and unmistakably herself. A pale crescent of fur marked her left shoulder like a brushstroke, faded and irregular. She had raised 2 previous litters that he knew of, and both times she had been exactly as she was now, internal, private, giving nothing away. He had never named her. The station had a quiet policy about that, and he agreed with the reasoning. Names created attachment, and attachment created assumptions, and this work required a patient, clear-eyed kind of attention that assumptions tended to distort. But in the margin of his field log, he had written the same single word beside her location every winter since he first recorded her. The word was steady. Thursday came cold and bright, and the stake stood exactly where he had placed it. The snow in front of the den showed nothing, not a single disruption, not a claw mark, not the long, shallow groove that a bear's belly left when it dragged itself out of a low entrance. He crouched at the clearing's edge and looked at the hollow opening for a long while. The darkness inside was complete. The bracken moved faintly in the edge of a breeze that barely reached the valley floor. Nothing else moved. 3 days was not alarming. 3 days, in the deep pull of winter torpor, was well within the range of natural behavior for a female bear, particularly in the back half of February when the cold still had authority over the land. He knew this. He had read it, studied it, seen it enough times that it had become a kind of practiced knowledge stored in the body rather than the mind. 3 days was not alarming, and yet he stayed longer than he needed to. There was something about the quality of the stillness around the den that morning that was different from ordinary stillness. He could not have said what it was, exactly, or defended it as an observation rather than a feeling. The woodpecker that usually worked the dead elm stand above the clearing had stopped. The stream down the slope, which had been running thin and audible all week, seemed quieter at the edges of his hearing. The forest felt the way a room feels when something in it has changed and you haven't yet identified what. He stood at the edge of the clearing until the cold worked its way through his jacket and into his shoulders. Then he pulled his log from his vest pocket and wrote the date, the temperature, the notation of undisturbed snow for a 3rd consecutive day. He drew a small circle around the entry and moved on. He would return tomorrow. He would give her the time and the space and the silence that this kind of watchfulness required, because the work had taught him that patience was not passivity. It was its own form of presence, a way of saying, without intruding, I am here, I am watching. I will not rush what is not ready to be rushed. The forest kept its quiet. He walked back through the trees, and it closed behind him like a held breath. He came back on Friday the way he had come back every morning that week, quietly, through the eastern tree line, staying low along the ridge where the snow was still firm enough to walk without breaking through. The stake was visible from 30 meters out. He didn't need to get closer to see that nothing had changed. The clearing was undisturbed. The entrance to the den held its darkness. The birch sapling stood without a mark on it. He settled into his position at the tree line, pulled his log from his vest, and began the routine notation. Date, temperature, wind direction, which was negligible that morning, barely a breath moving through the upper canopy. Sky conditions. Overcast, gray, white, the kind of flat light that made the snow look almost warm by comparison. He wrote without looking up, moving through the checklist the way long practice makes automatic, while some quieter part of his attention stayed fixed on the hollow in the granite shelf across the clearing. It was in that divided state pen, moving, eyes forward, that he heard it. He stopped writing before he was fully aware that he had stopped. The pen rested against the page. His body had made the decision before his mind could process what it had received, because what he had heard was so faint, so far below the threshold of ordinary attention, that catching it required everything non-essential to fall away at once. And it had. He stood perfectly still and listened with the whole of himself. Silence. The faint creak of a branch somewhere above. The faraway trickle of the slope stream working through ice. And then it came again. It was thin and high and brief, a sound with almost no weight to it, like a thread pulled taut and released. It lasted less than 2 seconds and dissolved back into the silence of the clearing so completely that a person moving, or talking, or simply breathing too loudly might have missed it entirely. But Merrick had heard it. It had passed through him and settled somewhere below the reach of language, in the part of the body that responds to certain things before the mind has found the words for them. He did not move forward. He did not reach for his radio or his recording equipment. He understood, in the way that 11 years of patient watching had taught him to understand things, that the correct response to this moment was stillness. Complete, respectful, absolute stillness. To move would be to intrude upon something that had not yet decided whether the world was safe. To make sound would be to push against a boundary that it was not his place to cross. The sound came a third time, slightly stronger than the first, slightly more formed, a small voice testing its own existence, reaching outward into a darkness it had always known, searching for the warmth that had always answered. It held in the air for a moment and then was gone. Inside that hollow in the granite shelf, in the sustained warmth of a body that had spent 4 months making itself into a shelter, something had drawn its first real breaths outside the passage of birth. Something that had not been in the world on Thursday now was. Its eyes were sealed. Its fur was thin and pale and still damp at the roots. It weighed perhaps half a kilogram, and it knew nothing yet except cold and warmth, silence and sound, the enormous and encompassing presence of its mother against which everything else in existence was, so far, merely absence. The mother had not stirred. There was no movement at the entrance, no shift in the quality of the shadow at the hollow's edge. She was deep inside, doing what her body knew to do without instruction or intervention, holding the new life close, breathing warmth into the small space between them, letting it find her the only way it knew how, by sound and by the particular scent that it had known before it knew anything else. Merrick remained at the tree line for a long time after the sound had stopped. The cold pressed in through his jacket, and he let it. The gray light moved slowly across the clearing, and he watched it. He was not waiting for something to happen. Something had already happened. He was simply bearing witness to the fact of it, the way the moment seemed to ask to be witnessed quietly, from a distance, with the kind of reverence that does not announce itself. He reached into his vest pocket eventually and uncapped his pen. In his field log, beneath the morning's routine notations, he wrote a single line in handwriting that was not quite steady. Vocalization from the interior. Neonatal. Time, 7:22. He capped the pen. He did not write anything else. Some observations recorded themselves more completely in the body than on paper, and he had learned, over 11 years, to trust that. The call Merrick made that afternoon was a short one. He used the kind of language that field work produces over time, precise, stripped of sentiment, built for clarity. Neonatal vocalization confirmed. Single source. Passive monitoring recommended. No intervention. The person on the other end of the line, a senior researcher named Dolores, who had been coordinating the Valley's bear study for 6 years, listened without interrupting, and then asked only 2 questions: distance of the monitoring post and whether the mother had shown any sign of distress. Merrick answered both. The line went quiet for a moment, and then she said they would have a team in place by morning. They arrived before first light on Saturday, 2 additional rangers and a field technician named Pavel who carried his equipment in a gray pack and spoke very little. They moved through the eastern tree line in single file, following the path Marek had compacted over 4 mornings of careful approach, and they set up the canvas blind 150 meters from the clearing in a stand of older spruce where the canopy was dense enough to absorb silhouette. The remote camera went in last, a small weatherproof unit, no larger than a closed fist, anchored to a root at the base of a spruce 12 meters from the den entrance. Its lens was aimed at the hollow in the granite shelf. Its presence was, by design, invisible. The first 2 days of monitoring produced very little on the screen. The clearing held its stillness. The entrance to the den remained a fixed darkness against the pale stone, interrupted occasionally by the faint rise and dispersal of breath steam from somewhere inside, barely perceptible, the kind of detail that only became visible when you had been watching long enough that your eyes had adjusted to the particular grammar of the place. The team rotated in pairs through shifts of 4 hours, eating quietly in the blind and keeping their radios on low and their movements slow. They had all done this kind of work before. They understood that watching was not passive. Watching, done properly, was its own form of discipline. The cub's voice was changing. By the 3rd day, the sounds coming from inside the den had shifted in a way that required no instruments to detect. The earliest vocalizations, those faint testing threads of sound that Marek had first heard on Friday morning, had given way to something more deliberate. Shorter calls, more evenly spaced, with a quality of demand in them that had been absent before. A cub learning the reliable relationship between sound and response, learning that if it called, the warmth came closer, the pressure of the large body adjusted, the world contracted back to the size of comfort. The team noted the changes in their logs with careful neutrality, but in the blind, between notations, they listened with something that was not neutral at all. Dolores had taken to arriving at the blind before her scheduled shift and staying past it. She said very little about why. The others did not ask. There was an atmosphere around the monitoring of this particular den that everyone had silently agreed to honor, a kind of collective patience that was not simply professional, but something closer to tenderness. The waiting had its own texture, days accumulating one on top of another, each one adding weight to the knowledge of what was inside that hollow, each morning bringing the same undisturbed clearing and the same fixed darkness, and the sounds, now clearer, now more confident, threading out through the stone and the cold air and into the ears of people who sat very still and let them land. On the 7th morning, at 8:06, according to Pavel's log, the camera registered movement. It was the mother. She came forward slowly, not emerging fully, but shifting her body toward the entrance until the front half of her crossed the threshold and entered the pale gray morning light. She was immense in a way the camera only partially conveyed, wide through the shoulders. Her coat, dark amber and matted along the flanks from months of lying, pressed against stone and earth. Her head was large and unhurried. She moved with the particular deliberateness of an animal that has been still for a very long time and is relearning the weight of its own body against the world. She raised her head and looked out across the clearing. Her nose worked in long, slow movements, reading the air with the thoroughness of an animal whose primary understanding of the world is chemical, layered, and exact. The clearing gave her nothing to react to. No scent of intrusion, no sound that did not belong. She held the entrance for a long moment, her breath rising in slow plumes that flattened and dissolved in the still air. And then, visible against the dark mass of her chest, tucked into the deep fold between her foreleg and her body there, the cub was the size of a man's forearm from elbow to wrist. Its fur was thin and pale at the edges, darker along the spine, and it was pressed so completely against its mother's body that it seemed less like a separate creature than an extension of her. Its eyes were sealed. Its paws, small beyond what seemed possible for an animal of this lineage, were curled lightly against the mother's chest. It made no sound in that moment. It simply existed, warm and present, and entirely unaware of the camera, the blind, the 5 people sitting 150 meters away in the cold morning dark, watching the screen with the kind of attention that has no professional name. In the blind, nobody spoke. Dolores had her hand pressed flat against the table in front of her, a gesture she was probably not aware of making. Pavel had stopped writing mid-sentence in his log. The mother remained at the entrance for 9 minutes. Then she drew back, and the darkness took them both, and the clearing was empty and still once more. "There she is," Merrick said very quietly, to no one, to all of them. The days between the 7th and the 12th carried their own particular weight. The team had settled into the rhythm of the monitoring the way people settle into any sustained and careful work, not with ease, exactly, but with a kind of practiced accommodation, the body learning to be still for long stretches, the mind learning to hold its attention loosely rather than gripping, so that small changes registered without effort. The cub's voice had continued to develop. By the 10th day, it had acquired a consistency and regularity that the team had begun, instinctively, to anticipate a set of calls spaced through the morning hours that arrived like punctuation in the long, the quiet sentences of the forest. They noted each one. They had stopped remarking on them aloud. The mother had come to the entrance 3 more times since the 7th day. Each emergence followed a similar pattern, a slow forward shift, a long reading of the air, a period of motionless assessment, and then a withdrawal back into the dark. Each time, the cub had been visible against her body, pressed close, unmoving, its small form so thoroughly integrated into the architecture of hers that it seemed less like an infant animal and more like a part of her that had simply grown outward. The team had confirmed, through the camera footage reviewed at length each evening, that the cub appeared healthy. Its limbs moved during the emergence sequences. Its head turned occasionally, responding to sound or warmth or the subtle shifts of its mother's breathing. Its eyes remained sealed through each observation. Until the 12th morning, the sky that day had cleared overnight into something the valley had not offered in weeks, a pale, luminous blue that arrived gradually above the eastern ridge and spread without hurry across the canopy. The light that came with it was the low, angled light of late February, not warm in any thermal sense, but golden in the way it moved across surfaces, touching the snow and the stone and the bare upper branches of the birch, stand with an even, unhurried brightness. Merrick had noticed it on the walk-in. It was the kind of morning that asked to be paid attention to. The mother emerged at 8:31. She came out fully this time, all of her, clearing the entrance threshold and moving several paces into the open ground of the clearing before stopping. It was the furthest she had come from the den since the monitoring began, and the team in the blind registered it without speaking, each person sitting slightly forward, the tablet screen between them catching the pale light from the gap in the canvas. She stood in the clearing and raised her head and was still for a long time, her coat catching the low morning light along its amber edges, her breath rising and spreading in the cold air above her. She looked out toward the tree line. She looked up, briefly, as if assessing the sky. Then she turned back toward the den and made a sound, a single low exhalation, resonant and brief, that the camera's audio recorded as a soft rumble and that carried, very faintly, across the 150 meters to the blind. The cub appeared in the entrance 17 seconds later. She came forward unsteadily, her front paws finding the ground at the threshold with the tentative pressure of an animal that has not yet learned to trust the surface beneath it. Her hind legs followed with effort, pushing her body across the lip of the entrance and out into the open air. She was larger than the first time they had seen her visibly, measurably larger, her limbs longer, her chest deeper, her head rounder and held higher. But she was still small in the way that made the watching difficult to sustain without feeling it somewhere in the body. Her fur, in the direct morning light, was the color of dark sand at its edges and deeper brown along her back, and it caught the low sun in a way the camera rendered almost gold. She stood at the entrance and did not move for a long moment, and then she opened her eyes. It was not a sudden thing. It happened the way many significant things happen gradually, and then completely, the left eye first, opening to a narrow line and then widening, the dark iris contracting slowly against the light it was receiving for the first time. Then the right, following the same slow process. By the time both were fully open, she was looking directly out into the clearing, into the pale morning air and the snow and the tree line beyond, and her eyes were dark and clear and entirely present in a way that was different from anything the team had observed in her before. Not the sealed, inward quality of a creature still becoming, something else, something that had arrived. She did not move toward her mother. She did not make a sound. She stood at the threshold of the den, and received the world in complete stillness, the way very young animals sometimes do when an experience is too large and too new to produce any response except absorption. The light was on her face. The cold air was, for the first time, something she could see as well as feel. The clearing stretched before her, its snow, its stone, the dark shapes of the trees at its edges, and she looked at it with the open, unfocused attention of a creature for whom everything is equally new and therefore equally worthy of the same sustained regard. The mother watched her. She had not approached. She stood where she had stopped, several paces into the clearing, and she watched her cub with the quiet, unhurried attention that she brought to everything, her head low, her body still, her breath slow and visible in the cold. She did not call to her. She did not move toward her or away. She simply held her position and waited, and the patience in that waiting was not a strategy or a decision, but something older and more physical than either of those things. The patience of an animal that understands, in whatever way understanding exists below the reach of language, that some moments require only presence, not action. Then, after a long stillness that the team would later estimate at nearly 3 minutes, the mother walked back to her cub. She moved slowly, without urgency, crossing the open ground of the clearing in a straight and unhurried line. The cub heard her coming and turned its head toward the sound of her approach, its small body steadying as the familiar warmth and scent arrived close. The mother reached her and lowered her great head until her nose rested gently against the top of the cub's head. She held it there, not a nuzzle, not a grooming gesture, simply a contact, sustained and still, the way a hand rests on a shoulder in a moment that doesn't require words. Her breath moved the fine fur at the crown of the cub's head in slow, even intervals. The cub leaned into it. That was all. A small body finding the familiar axis of its world and adjusting toward it, the way a plant adjusts toward light, not a decision, not an act of will, simply the body doing what the body knows. But in the blind, 150 meters away, the effect of that small movement was not small at all. Dolores had pressed her hand flat against the table again, harder this time. Pavel had set his pen down entirely. Marek was looking at the screen with an expression that had stopped being a professional expression some time ago, and that he was not trying to correct. Sonia, who was the youngest member of the team, and in only her second year on the Valley study, said the only thing that was said in the blind during those minutes. She said it very quietly, not quite to anyone, her eyes still on the screen. "Look at her, she's just showing her. She's just showing her all of it." Nobody responded. Nobody needed to. The image on the screen held what it held, a mother and her 12-day-old daughter standing together in the low morning light of a February clearing. One enormous and still and patient. One barely larger than a man's two hands placed side by side, and the team in the blind sat with it the way you sit with something you know, even as it is happening, that you will carry for the rest of your life. Not because it was extraordinary in any way the wider world would easily recognize, but because it was so completely and quietly itself, because it asked for nothing, because it was simply, undeniably, there. The mother raised her head eventually. She moved back toward the den entrance, and the cub turned and followed her, its gait still uncertain, its small body rocking slightly with the effort of the short walk across the uneven ground. They crossed the threshold together, the large dark shape and the small one, and the den received them, and the clearing was still, and the morning light continued to move across the snow in its slow and golden way, indifferent and beautiful, the same as it had always been. The decision to withdraw the monitoring post was not made quickly, and it was not made by any single person. It arrived the way many of the team's decisions arrived, through a gradual convergence of observation and instinct, and the kind of unspoken professional agreement that forms between people who have spent enough time doing careful work together in quiet places. Dolores raised it first, on the evening of the 14th day, during the debrief that the team conducted each night in the low warmth of the field station. She said that the data they had collected was substantial, that the cub's development was tracking well within healthy parameters, and that continued monitoring at close range carried a risk of habituation that would not serve the animals in the long run. She said it plainly and without sentiment. But everyone in the room understood that there was something else in it too, a recognition that what they had been witnessing had reached a kind of natural boundary, a point past which their presence became less a form of care and more a form of intrusion. The withdrawal was scheduled for the 17th day. In the intervening nights, each member of the team worked through their own portion of the data footage logs, acoustic recordings, field notes, producing the careful, structured documentation that would eventually become part of the Valley's long-term bear study archive. The work was absorbing in the way that precise and meaningful work tends to be, and it carried its own quiet satisfaction. But there were moments, sitting alone with a screen full of timestamps and notations, when a person would pause and find themselves simply looking at a still frame from the camera footage, the clearing in its pale morning light, the entrance to the den, a dark shape at the threshold, and staying with it longer than the work required. On the morning of the 17th day, they packed the blind before first light. It was a clear morning, colder than the previous few had been. The sky above the ridge, a deep and starless black that was only just beginning to soften at its eastern edge. They worked in near silence, folding the canvas in sections, coiling the cable from the remote camera, pressing the wooden stake markers down flat into the soil and covering them with loose snow so that the clearing would show no trace of what had stood there. Marek retrieved the camera from its anchor at the spruce root. He held it for a moment before placing it in Pavel's pack, a small, weatherproof rectangle that had recorded 17 days of a life beginning, and then he let it go and straightened and looked at the den entrance one last time from close range. The hollow was quiet. The bracken at its edges was slightly more disturbed than it had been on the first morning he had stood here, pressed down and pushed aside by the repeated passage of a large body crossing the threshold. The ground in front of the entrance had lost its pristine snow cover entirely. Now it was packed earth and old ice and the shallow impressions of paws, large and small, overlapping in patterns that told the story of the past 10 days more honestly than any log entry. He did not photograph it. Some records were better kept in the body than on paper or a screen. They carried everything out in 2 trips and loaded it into the vehicles on the access road. Then Marek and Sonia walked the outer perimeter of the site for the final time, a standard closeout procedure, checking that nothing had been left, that the site was clean. They moved in opposite directions around the clearing's edge and met on the southern side, near the stand of older spruce where the canopy came down low and the light, even in full morning, arrived in broken pieces through the branches. Sonia was looking toward the far edge of the clearing when she stopped walking. She touched Marek's arm without speaking and pointed. The mother was there. She stood at the precise northern boundary of the clearing, at the point where the open ground ended and the older forest began, where the compacted snow of the exposed hillside gave way to the deeper, softer accumulation beneath the spruce canopy, and the light changed quality, and the air held a different temperature. She was standing with her body half turned toward the trees, her head raised, her attention directed into the dark interior of the grove in the particular way of an animal reading a space before committing to it. She was not moving. She was assessing. The cub was at her side, not pressed against her, as she had been in the early days of the monitoring, but beside her, on her own 4 feet, her small body angled in the same direction as her mother's, her head raised at the same angle, her attention pointed at the same wall of dark trunks and low branches and deep shadow that her mother was reading. She was not leaning. She was standing independently, her legs beneath her with a steadiness that had not been there a week ago, her weight distributed with the beginning of the confidence that her mother carried as a matter of simple fact. They were not touching. They were simply beside each other, oriented the same way, looking at the same thing. Marek and Sonia stood without moving at the southern edge of the clearing and watched. The mother held her position for what felt like a long time. She read the forest with the thoroughness that the forest required: scent and sound, and the quality of the stillness between the trees, the information that an animal of her experience could extract from an environment that looked, to a human eye, simply like more forest. Whatever she found there satisfied her. She lowered her head slightly, shifted her weight forward onto her front paws, and stepped across the boundary line between the clearing and the trees. The cub followed without hesitation, one step, and then another, her paws finding the softer ground beneath the canopy with a kind of focused attention that was entirely her own, not her mother's, the particular concentration of a young animal encountering a new texture for the first time, processing it, incorporating it. She did not look back. She moved forward into the shadow of the spruce grove, and the forest received her the way it receives everything that belongs to it, without ceremony, without announcement, simply by closing around her, the dark shapes of the trunks and the low-hanging branches folding back into their own depth until there was nothing to see except forest, layered and still and complete. And then they were gone. The clearing held the absence of them, the way a room holds the absence of someone who has just left, not empty, exactly, but changed, the air carrying the recent fact of a presence that was no longer there. The tracks in the snow at the northern edge led to the tree line and stopped. The spruce grove was quiet and dark and gave nothing back. The low morning light continued to move across the open ground of the clearing in its slow and indifferent way, reaching the far stone face of the granite shelf, illuminating the entrance to the den, which was just a hollow in the rock now, bracken-edged and dim, the warmth that had lived inside it for 17 days, already beginning its long, slow return to the temperature of the surrounding stone. Marek and Sonia stood at the southern edge of the clearing for a long time after. Neither of them moved toward the tree line. Neither of them spoke. There was a quality to the silence that the clearing held in those minutes that was different from the silence of the monitoring days, fuller, somehow, and more complete, as if the forest had exhaled something it had been holding and was now simply breathing normally again. The stream down the slope was audible, running more freely now than it had been in February. The ice along its edges reduced to thin shelves that caught the light and released it. Somewhere in the upper canopy, a single bird was moving through the branches, its small weight shifting the tips of the spruce in a barely perceptible wave that crossed from east to west and then was still. They walked back to the access road without speaking. The equipment was loaded. The vehicles were cold and took a moment to turn over. Marek sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, his hands on the wheel, looking at the tree line through the windscreen at the dark interior of the valley forest, at the particular stand of spruce on the northern slope that he would not be able to identify from this distance, but that he knew was there, that he would always know was there, that he would think of every February from this point forward when the snow fell and the valley grew quiet and the forest kept its patient, unhurried counsel. He started the engine. The road out of the valley was long and narrow and ran beside the slope stream for most of its length, the water moving steadily below them, bright where the sun caught it, dark where the bank shaded it, alive in the way that water in early spring is always alive, purposeful, unhurried, going where it was always going, carrying everything forward, leaving nothing behind.